The Imperial Japanese Navy described submarine service as the domain of its most technically accomplished officers. That was the official position from the first day the submarine force was built into the fleet's operational structure, and it held through every promotion board assessment, every academy posting decision, every personnel document that assigned a man to submarine duty rather than to the surface combatants that the Naval Staff's doctrine placed at the center of Japanese naval power. Submarine officers were technically educated, selected from the upper tier of Naval Academy graduates, trained for missions that required independent judgment at ranges far from fleet support. The men who served beneath them, the petty officers and ratings who maintained the machinery, loaded the torpedoes, stood the watches, were told they served in an elite instrument, that the submarine was a weapon of decisive potential, that the missions they performed had strategic weight that the surface fleet's more visible engagements did not always carry. What the Naval Ministry's personnel documents did not include was the casualty figure that defined what submarine service actually cost. Of the approximately 200 submarines the Imperial Japanese Navy operated in the Pacific War, 128 were sunk before the war ended. That is a destruction rate of 64%. Not damaged, not withdrawn from service. Gone, most of them to depths from which no recovery was possible and from which no survivor account would ever emerge to document what the final minutes had been. Approximately 10,000 men served in the Japanese submarine force during the Pacific War. Of those, an estimated 3,500 were killed, a casualty rate of roughly 35%, lower than the German U-boat force's catastrophic 75%, but distributed across a force that had been given a strategic doctrine so fundamentally misaligned with how the Pacific War actually developed that the men who died did not die achieving the objectives the doctrine had specified. They died attempting missions that the Naval Staff had designed for a war that did not materialize, in submarines that were built for fleet engagements that never came, executing strategies that the American fleet's actual capabilities had already rendered obsolete before most of the patrols that cost men's lives had ever been ordered. The honor was genuine. The selection was real. The strategic framework that sent those men to their deaths was a catastrophic institutional failure that the Naval Staff did not acknowledge and the crews were never told about. That is the specific form the Japanese submarine service took, and understanding it requires beginning, where all honest accounting of it must begin, with what the Japanese submarine was built to do and what the Pacific War actually required it to do instead. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine doctrine in 1941 was built around a single strategic concept, the fleet engagement. The dominant school of thought among Japanese naval planners held that the decisive battle between the American and Japanese fleets, the engagement that would determine control of the Pacific, would be won or lost by surface forces in a daylight gun duel, and that the submarine's role in this battle was to attrite the American fleet as it crossed the Pacific, reducing its numerical strength so that the Japanese surface fleet could engage it on favorable terms. The submarine was not conceived in Japanese doctrine as a commerce raider in the German model. It was conceived as a fleet weapon, a component of the overall force designed to reduce the enemy's capital ships before the decisive engagement. This doctrine shaped every design decision the Japanese submarine building program made through the 1930s. The I-class fleet submarine, the large ocean-going type that formed the backbone of the Japanese submarine force, was built to fleet doctrine requirements. The I-400 class, the largest submarines ever constructed at the time of their commissioning, displaced 6,500 tons surfaced and could carry 3 floatplane bombers in a watertight cylindrical hangar forward of the conning tower, intended to strike targets at ranges that no surface ship could approach. The standard I-class fleet submarines of the I-15, I-16 and I-19 types displaced between 2,200 and 2,600 tons surfaced, carried 17 to 19 Type 95 oxygen-propelled torpedoes, mounted a 14-centimeter deck gun, and were designed for ranges exceeding 16,000 nautical miles, enough to cross the Pacific and return without refueling. They were sophisticated, capable, and built for a strategic role that the war's first 6 months had already eliminated as a viable operational concept. By the end of 1942, the fleet engagement the doctrine had been designed to support had not occurred in the form the planners had anticipated. The carrier battles of 1942 had demonstrated that the decisive Pacific engagements would be fought by aircraft launched from ships that never came within gun range of each other. The fleet doctrine's foundation, the daylight surface engagement between capital ships, was not the war the Pacific was producing. The Japanese submarine force, built and trained for a specific strategic purpose, found itself in a war where that purpose had evaporated and no coherent replacement had been provided. The replacement missions that the Naval Staff assigned to the submarine force in place of the fleet attrition role were missions the submarines were not designed for, were not optimized for, and in many cases actively unsuited for by the same design decisions that had made them capable fleet weapons. Begin with the machine, because the Japanese submarine's physical character imposed conditions on its crew that no official description of submarine service had anticipated, and that the design decisions made for fleet doctrine created as unavoidable consequences of the doctrine itself. The standard I-class fleet submarine operated with a crew of between 80 and 105 men, depending on the variant and the mission configuration. She was large by any submarine standard of the era, large enough that the American submariners who encountered Japanese submarines and captured documents or occasional direct contact routinely noted their size with something approaching respect. But size in a submarine is not the same as habitability, and the specific way in which the I-class was large was the way that fleet doctrine required. She carried range, she carried weapons, she carried the fuel and provisions for extended independent operations far from bases. The space that was not occupied by these requirements was the space the crew inhabited. The crew's berthing was arranged in the same tiered configuration that characterized every submarine in every navy. Pipe frame bunks, typically 2 or 3 high, in spaces forward and aft of the control room. The Japanese system differed from the German in one specific and important respect. It was not hot bunking in the German sense, where the number of bunks was deliberately less than the number of crew members and men shared bunks on opposing watch schedules. Japanese submarines attempted to provide each man with an assigned bunk. The attempt was not always successful in practice, particularly as the war progressed and crew complements were adjusted upward to accommodate expanded mission requirements. But the architectural intention was 1 bunk per man, in contrast to the German system's explicit acknowledgement that the boat could not accommodate its crew simultaneously. The accommodation this produced was adequate by the narrow standards of submarine service in any navy, and inadequate by any other standard, and the gap between adequate by submarine standards and adequate by any other standard was the gap the men lived in for patrols that by 1942 and 1943 regularly ran 60 to 90 days without surfacing in port. 60 to 90 days. The German U-boat patrols that the existing project script describes as defining the worst conditions of submarine service in the war ran typically between 60 and 90 days as well. The comparison is instructive because it establishes the shared baseline of what extended submarine operation at this period of technology imposed on any crew before the specific Japanese additions to that baseline are addressed. The air inside a Japanese fleet submarine after 2 weeks of Pacific operation was documented by the Imperial Navy's Submarine Medical Officer Program, a relatively recent addition to fleet submarine operations, established in 1942, partly in response to health problems that extended patrols were producing in crews, in terms that the official reports rendered with a clinical detachment that the men experiencing it did not share. Carbon dioxide accumulated in the boat's atmosphere during submerged operations, at a rate that depended on the crew size, the duration of submergence, and the efficiency of the CO2 absorption system. The absorption system used monoethanolamine as the primary scrubbing agent in the standard Japanese submarine installation. It worked within its design parameters. Its design parameters were for submergence durations that the operational requirements of Pacific War Service regularly exceeded. After 18 hours submerged, a submergence period that became routine rather than exceptional during the periods of American anti-submarine activity that intensified through 1943 and 1944, the CO2 concentration in the boat's atmosphere reached levels that the medical officers documented as producing headaches, reduced cognitive function, and increasing respiratory distress in the crew. After 24 hours, the symptoms intensified, Men not actively required at their stations were encouraged to lie still to minimize their oxygen consumption. The crew's collective stillness in a boat sealed against the ocean at whatever depth the captain judged safe from the destroyers above was not stillness born of rest or of discipline. It was the specific stillness of men in a sealed container managing their own metabolic rate as a survival strategy. The heat compounded everything. The Pacific Ocean's thermal characteristics imposed conditions on Japanese submarines that the North Atlantic U-boat war did not replicate, and that the Japanese submarine's design had not fully accounted for. The surface water temperature in the operational areas of the Central and Western Pacific ran between 82 and 88 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. A submerged submarine equilibrates its hull temperature with the surrounding water over time. At depth, below the thermocline, water temperatures drop to between 45 and 55 degrees, cold enough that the hull temperature fell, and the interior condensation became severe, with moisture condensing on every steel surface and dripping onto equipment, documents, food stores, and sleeping men. At shallower depths, above the thermocline, the water temperature remained warm, and the hull temperature reflected it, with the crew's body heat and the electrical machinery's waste, heat-producing interior temperatures that the medical officers recorded in ranges between 95 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit during extended shallow submergence in tropical waters. The combination of high temperature, elevated CO2, and the physical compression of 90 or more men into a sealed volume with inadequate ventilation produced an atmosphere that the submarine medical officers' reports describe with a specific vocabulary: thick, wet, tasting of machinery and bodies, and the particular staleness of air that has passed through too many lungs in too little time. Men coming on watch from their bunks move through this atmosphere to their stations. Men coming off watch move back through it to their bunks. The atmosphere did not change with the watch rotation. It was the same air, more depleted, more saturated, warmer. The freshwater allocation on Japanese fleet submarines during extended Pacific patrols was constrained by the same priority hierarchy that governed every warship's water management, with the specific addition that the submarine's evaporator capacity and fuel allocation for running the evaporators was limited by the operational requirement for stealth. Running the evaporators required power. Running power systems made noise. Making noise when American destroyers were in the area was a decision with specific consequences. The practical result was that fresh water for personal hygiene was available in quantities that the medical officers assessed as inadequate for maintaining basic skin health in a tropical environment, and that the crew assessed, with less clinical detachment, as essentially nothing. Men on 60-day Pacific patrols bathed when the boat surfaced at night and the tactical situation permitted, which, through the middle and late war period as American air and surface anti-submarine capabilities expanded, was less frequently than it had been in the early war period. Between opportunities, they wiped down with rags moistened from whatever fresh water could be spared, which was not much, and they accepted the condition of their skin and their clothing as another element of the environment they were living in rather than a problem that admitted of solution. The smell of a Japanese submarine on extended Pacific patrol was documented in the accounts of American naval personnel who boarded surrendered or captured Japanese submarines at the war's end, with a consistency that suggests it was one of the most immediately striking physical characteristics of the experience. The American accounts are not clinical. They use the vocabulary that the encounter itself produced, words for an intensity of accumulated biological and mechanical odor that had no comparison in any surface ship experience the Americans had had. The Japanese crew members aboard those submarines had long since ceased to register it. The adaptation was complete and total. The Americans who boarded them noticed it immediately and documented it in language that made clear it was unlike anything they had encountered in American submarine service, which was itself not a fragrant environment. This was not a failure of Japanese standards or Japanese cleanliness. It was the specific product of sealing 90 men in a metal hull in tropical water for 60 days with inadequate ventilation, inadequate fresh water, and the accumulated biological output of a crew living at the minimum margin of physical maintenance that the mission permitted. The numbers that establish what Japanese submarine service actually cost in the specific currency of mission and attrition deserve their concentrated examination here, because they reveal something about the institutional gap between doctrine and operational reality that the Japanese case makes more starkly visible than any other submarine force of the war. Japanese submarines sank 184 Allied merchant vessels during the entire Pacific War. This figure requires immediate context. German U-boats sank approximately 2,900 Allied merchant ships during the same period. The disparity is not explained by the Japanese submarine force's size relative to the German. The Japanese force was smaller, but not proportionally smaller. It is explained by the strategic doctrine that governed Japanese submarine employment. Japanese submarines were not used for commerce raiding in any systematic way until 1943, by which point the American anti-submarine capability had expanded sufficiently that the campaign that should have been conducted in 1942 was being attempted in conditions that made it far more costly and far less productive than it would have been at the war's beginning. What Japanese submarines were used for, with increasing frequency as the war progressed and the surface fleet's ability to resupply isolated island garrisons declined, was supply runs, transport missions. The I-class fleet submarine, designed for fleet attrition and long-range scouting, was loaded with food, ammunition, medicine, and fuel and sent to Guadalcanal, to New Georgia, to Bougainville, to every island where the garrison needed supplies that the surface ships could no longer safely deliver. The submarine that surfaced at night off the beach, offloaded drums of rice and medicine, and attempted to return before daylight was not performing the mission that its designers had specified, its crew had trained for, or its doctrine had described. It was performing the mission that the war's strategic reality required in a platform that was not designed for it, with all the specific operational costs that the mismatch produced. The supply mission required the submarine to approach shallow coastal waters, the most dangerous operating environment for a large, deep-diving fleet submarine that was designed for open ocean operations at depth. It required surfacing at predictable times and locations. The beach approach had to occur at night, but the timing was constrained by the supply schedule, which American intelligence became increasingly capable of anticipating. It required the crew to perform rapid offloading under conditions that combined physical exhaustion from the patrol with the specific stress of operating in shallow water at night, near an island that American aircraft were patrolling in daylight, and that American PT boats were patrolling at night. Of the 128 Japanese submarines sunk during the Pacific War, a significant proportion were lost during or immediately after supply runs to island garrisons. The men who died in those sinkings were not performing the fleet attrition mission that had justified the submarine force's existence and the doctrine that had trained them. They were delivering rice. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and the Battle of Midway in June 1942 established the parameters of the Japanese submarine's actual strategic situation before most of the crews who would die in that situation had reported to their boats. At Midway, the Japanese submarine cordon, 17 submarines positioned to intercept American fleet units and provide early warning of the American force's composition and course, reached its assigned positions 2 days late because the Naval Staff had issued the operation order on a compressed timeline that the submarine's transit speeds could not accommodate. American fleet passed through the cordon's planned position before the submarines arrived. The cordon detected nothing. The battle proceeded without the submarine force contributing the intelligence and attrition functions it had been assigned. The 4 Japanese carriers sunk at Midway went down without the submarine force having played any role in the engagement's development. The 17 submarines that failed to arrive in time were not crewed by incompetent men or commanded by inadequate officers. They were operating boats that traveled at the speeds physics and engineering allowed, on a schedule that had been set without adequate accounting for those speeds, in a planning process that the Naval Staff conducted without the operational realistic constraints of the men who would execute it. The gap between the plan and what was physically achievable was a gap the crew could not close and had not been consulted about. This gap, between what the Naval Staff planned and what the boats and men could actually accomplish, was the structural feature of Japanese submarine operations that the crews lived inside for the entire war. The specific incident that illuminates what this cost at its most concentrated is I-1. I-1 was a Johnson-type submarine, commissioned in 1926 and still operational in 1943, an aging boat by the standards of the mid-war Japanese force, but one whose crew was experienced and whose captain, Lieutenant Commander Sakai Kashimoto, had conducted multiple supply runs to Guadalcanal before the night of January 29, 1943. On that night, I-1 was approaching Guadalcanal on a supply run, carrying provisions and mail for the Guadalcanal garrison. She was intercepted by two New Zealand corvettes, HMN ZS Kiwi and HMN ZS Moa, which had been specifically positioned based on American intelligence about Japanese supply submarine schedules. The engagement that followed was not the engagement that Japanese submarine doctrine had contemplated. Kiwi rammed Y-1 3 times, deliberately using the corvette's hull as a weapon against the submarine's pressure hull. I-1 was beached on the Guadalcanal shore to prevent sinking. Kashimoto and most of his crew were killed or captured. The documents recovered from I-1, including portions of the Japanese submarine communication code, were of significant intelligence value to the Americans. The specific detail of I-1's loss that belongs to any honest accounting of Japanese submarine service is this: she was delivering mail, not torpedoes, not fleet intelligence. Mail for soldiers on an island that the Japanese High Command had already privately assessed as lost, on a supply run whose tactical vulnerability was known to American intelligence before the boat left port. The crew who died on E-1 on the night of January 29, 1943, died on a mission that the fleet doctrine that had justified their training and their assignment had never specified as a submarine's purpose. They died because the war had moved beyond the doctrine without the doctrine being revised, and the revision had not been communicated to the men operating within the old framework. The psychological weight of Japanese submarine service in the middle and late war period had a specific character that distinguished it from the U-boat experience documented in the existing project script, and the distinction is worth establishing precisely because it reveals something about the cultural context that shaped what the Imperial Navy's institutional framework required the men to carry. The German U-boat fatalism, the grim mathematical awareness of survival odds, the gallows humor, the bond of men who had collectively assessed their own probability and found it inadequate and served anyway, operated in an institutional culture that, for all its rigidity, permitted the expression of the thing it was managing. Donitz's personal relationship with his crews, his reputation for knowing the name of every man who served under him, his practice of meeting returning boats at the dock, these were not trivial gestures. They acknowledged the reality of the cost and expressed within the limits of military hierarchy something that resembled personal accountability for asking men to bear it. The Imperial Japanese Navy's institutional framework provided no equivalent acknowledgement. The crew of a Japanese submarine that returned from a patrol did not return to a commander who expressed personal awareness of what the patrol had cost them. They returned to an institution that assessed operational results, recorded losses, and issued orders for the next patrol. The concept that a commanding admiral might acknowledge in personal terms the weight of what the men under his command were being asked to bear was not available within the Japanese naval culture of the war period as an institutional practice. It was available sometimes in the informal bonds of small units, in the specific warmth that could exist between a submarine captain and his crew, in the mess arrangements that the Japanese naval tradition organized around a communal formality that had its own kind of cohesion, but not as an institutional acknowledgement. The result was that the men absorbed the cost of the war's strategic failure silently, not in the specific way that American or British sailors who did not discuss their experiences were silent. That silence was chosen within a culture that would have permitted discussion. This silence was the silence of men in an institutional framework that had not provided a mechanism for the discussion and did not invite one. You stood your watch, you maintained your station, you returned from the patrol, and you reported and you received orders for the next one. The gap between the mission the doctrine had promised and the mission the war was producing, the rice deliveries, the mail runs, the supply runs to islands the Naval Staff had already privately classified as untenable, was not a subject the framework provided language for. The men carried it without language, which is a different and in some ways heavier burden than carrying it with language and choosing silence. The medical consequences of Japanese submarine service followed the patterns that extended submergence in tropical conditions, produced with a consistency the post-war health studies of surviving veterans documented. Chronic respiratory conditions from sustained exposure to elevated CO2 and the specific atmospheric chemistry of a sealed submarine in tropical water. Hearing damage from the diesel engines and from the specific frequency profile of depth-charge detonations, which concentrated acoustic energy in the frequency ranges most damaging to the human auditory system, and which the submarine's hull transmitted to every man inside it with an efficiency that no other naval platform replicated. Dermatological conditions from weeks without adequate bathing in tropical heat, fungal infections, bacterial skin infections, the specific chronic irritation of skin that was never fully clean and never fully dry. And the other thing, the thing the post-war medical studies classified as psychological sequelae of combat stress, and that the surviving veterans of Japanese submarine service described in the accounts they gave to the researchers who sought them out in the 1970s and 1980s, in terms that were specific and consistent across men who had served on different boats in different theaters. The specific quality of the sound of a depth charge detonating at close range, transmitted through the hull of a submerged submarine, and what that sound became in the years after the war. Most of them said it did not leave. They said it was not a memory in the sense that other memories were memories, a thing you could call up or decline to call up. They said it was a thing that called itself up, that certain sounds, certain frequencies, certain qualities of impact transmitted through a solid surface, a truck backfiring in the street, a door slamming in an adjacent room, thunder at close range, called it up automatically before the brain had processed that the thing it was hearing was not what the body had decided it was. They said you learned to manage this. They said managing it was not the same as it not happening. One of those men was Petty Officer First Class Hiroyuki Tanaka of the Submarine, or I-168. I-168 was a Kaidai-type submarine, medium-sized, commissioned in 1934. She has documented history for one specific action. On June 6, 1942, 2 days after the Battle of Midway, I-168, under Commander Yahachi Tanabe, torpedoed and sank the damaged American carrier USS Yorktown, which had been under tow attempting to return to Pearl Harbor after surviving the initial battle damage. The same salvo also sank the destroyer USS Hammond. It was the most significant single success of a Japanese submarine in the Pacific War's first year, and it was achieved through skilled seamanship and aggressive command rather than any structural advantage in doctrine or equipment. Hiroyuki Tanaka was a torpedo petty officer aboard I-168 during that engagement. He was 23 years old. He was at his station in the torpedo room during the approach and the attack, maintaining the readiness of the torpedoes that sank Yorktown and Hammond in a compartment that the approach to the American force required to be completely silent. Every unnecessary system off, every man still, the boat creeping toward the damaged carrier through waters where American destroyers were actively searching for exactly the threat I-168 represented. He served aboard I-168 until October 1943, when the submarine was sunk by the American destroyer USS Softly, east of Bougainville during a patrol. Tanaka survived because he was in the forward torpedo room when the depth charges struck, and the forward section of the boat maintained watertight integrity long enough for him to exit through the forward escape trunk as the boat sank. He was in the water for 4 hours before a Japanese surface vessel found him. He was one of 6 survivors from a crew of 91. He returned to Japan and spent the rest of the war in a shore assignment, which he described in a 1976 interview conducted by a Japanese naval historian as the most difficult period of his service. Not because the shore assignment was dangerous, but because he knew where his crewmates were and could not stop knowing it. After the war, he returned to his home prefecture of Ehime, 2 prefectures from where Yukikaze's Kenji Mochizuki had fished, and he fished the same waters until he could no longer manage the boat alone. He died in 1989 at the age of 70. His daughter described him in a 2001 account as a man who could not sleep near a window when it rained heavily, because the sound of rain on glass at night was a sound that had a specific association she did not understand until she read, after his death, the account he had written in a notebook that she found in his workshop. The notebook was not addressed to anyone. It described the sound a depth charge makes when it detonates at close range, and the hull transmits it to the men inside. It described the sound at length, with the specific attention of a man who had spent decades trying to get the description precise enough that the sound would exist somewhere outside his body. He had not shown it to anyone. He had not thrown it away.